So I think we are ready to begin. I see that a couple more people have streamed in. So welcome again to the event, and I'm delighted to introduce Nicholas Payne, QC, who is the Commissioner for Public Law and the Law in Wales. Nick, over to you.
Good afternoon and welcome to this consultation event that's being held in connection with the Law Commission's project on coal tip safety in Wales. I'm Nicholas Payne and I'm one of the 5 commissioners who head the Law Commission. I'll say a bit more about the Commission later in this session, but just by way of brief introduction, we're an independent statutory body tasked with reviewing the law in England and Wales and making recommendations on how to make it work better. Since devolution, we've been able to undertake work specifically at the request of the Welsh Government, and work specifically for Wales is a very important part of our work. Last autumn, we were asked by the Welsh Government to undertake a project reviewing the law governing coal tip safety in Wales. It's a contribution to the wider coal tip safety work that the Welsh Government is carrying out itself. We've recently published a consultation paper, and the focus of this afternoon is to introduce the project and the consultation paper to you, because we're keen to get as many responses to it as people would like to make to us. This afternoon's event will fall into 3 parts. First of all, you will hear an update from the Welsh Government on its ongoing coal tip safety work. That will be presented by Laurie Frater, who is the head of coal tip safety within the Welsh Government, together with Tim Marples of the Coal Authority. After that, the team and I, working on the Law Commission project, will present our project and tell you more about the consultation paper and the issues that we are seeking views upon. The third part will be a question and answer session. Now, please do use the Q&A function which you have on your screens to send questions either to the Law Commission representatives or to Laurie and Tim. Please do send them in at any time in the course of the afternoon, and in the third part of the session we will try to answer them. If we run out of time, we'll do our best to send you a reply after tonight. But do please note that none of us are able to answer any questions about individual tips. If you want information on them, you should contact your local authority, and if you have immediate concerns, you can contact the Welsh Government's free telephone helpline number, which Laurie will tell you more about. So at this stage, I will hand over to Laurie and Tim to tell you about the wider work that the Welsh Government is carrying out. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good evening, everyone. As Nicholas has said, I'm Laurie Frater, and I'm the head of the Coal Tip Safety Task Force for the Welsh Government, leading on all aspects of the coal tip programme of work. In this presentation, I will provide a brief overview of the coal tip safety programme being led by the Welsh Government, and then we'll hand over to Tim Marples from the Coal Authority, who will provide a brief overview of the programme's operational works. Firstly, I would like to thank everyone for attending this evening, and to the Law Commission for the work it is undertaking on behalf of the Welsh Ministers on the review of coal tip safety legislation. My particular thanks go to Nick, Lisa, Poppy and Henny for all the work they have done to produce the consultation paper. If we could commence the slides now, please. Thank you. If we could move on to the next slide, onto the second slide, that'd be great, thanks. In many ways, the history of Wales is synonymous with the history of the coal industry. Coal was key to the Industrial Revolution, and Wales's coalfields were a major contributor to this revolution. As the industry developed and deeper mining became more commonplace, the unwanted or unsaleable coal was accumulated into tips. Coal tips are a legacy of this coal mining past, and the typology of Wales means the coal tip legacy is different to other parts of the UK, as often these tips were built into the hillside and close to communities. In February last year, as a result of the storms Ciara and Dennis, and with the volume of increased rainfall, there was a landslide at one of these disused coal tips at Tylestown in Rhondda, with over 60,000 tonnes of tip descending into the river below. For clarity, when we say disused coal tip, it's a tip which is no longer associated with an active mine and no longer used for disposing. And the majority of tips in Wales are now classed as disused. Immediately following the landslide, the First Minister met with the Secretary of State for Wales and commissioned the Coal Authority to assess the status of tips across Wales. In addition, soon after, the Coal Tip Safety Policy Task Force was created to deliver a programme of work to address the issues relating to coal spoil tips highlighted by the Tylestown landslide. In March last year, a Coal Authority public helpline was launched for the public to inform the authority about any concerns related to coal tips. Next slide, please. Before looking at the programme of work, I would like a quick overview of who is involved in this programme. As I've mentioned, it's led by the Welsh Government and the Coal Tip Safety Team. And we are responsible for the oversight and delivery of the programme, including leading on the development of the policy and subsequent legislation. Our partner organisations include the Coal Authority, with Tim being present this evening, who have been undertaking inspections and also importantly collecting data on the number, location and status of coal tips. Key other partners in this programme are local authorities and the Welsh Local Government Association, who have been contributing also to the inspections and data collection, and as tip owners undertaking the maintenance of coal tips. In addition, we have NRW as managers of the Welsh estates are also key partners. And we have also been working with local resilience forums in relation to the preparation of any emergency planning requirements that may be needed for specific tips. But also at an intergovernmental level, our partnership includes BEIS, who are the sponsoring body for the Coal Authority, as well as the Wales Office and the Cabinet Office, with input from the Civil Contingency Secretariat and Go Science. Next slide, please. In terms of the programme of work, it has been split into a number of different projects. First off, it was about obtaining a clear understanding of the extent of any coal tip risk, including the number of tips, location, ownership, and assessing the status of the tips. Ensuring that there were necessary emergency requirements are in place in relation to any of the higher risk-rated tips, and I will explain that further in the next slide. And this involves working with the local resilience forums. And also putting in place a regular inspection programme that is not mandated for in the current legislative regime, and maintenance works to be undertaken which address any issues identified from inspections. And there's also a number of technology trials that are also ongoing. Tim from the Coal Authority will discuss these in more detail later on. But also we also undertook a review of the legislative framework to see if it is fit for purpose and now developing new policy. The Law Commission review is an important element of the evidence required to develop the policy to provide an effective management regime for coal tips in Wales. And finally, the Welsh Government is also looking at the potential opportunities to reclaim many disused coal tips, turning this negative legacy into something positive for Welsh communities. This is different to maintenance works on tips, which are required on an ongoing basis. The reclamation programme looks at opportunities to turn these tips into something more productive and beneficial for communities in Wales. Potential examples may include their role in green networks, recreational, leisure, but also many other potential opportunities depending on the specific circumstances of a tip. I will look at some of these in more detail. Next slide, please. Understanding the extent of coal tips in Wales is a complex task, and the mapping of disused coal tips is still ongoing. This is a complicated piece of work, particularly as there's never been any central register of coal tips anywhere in the UK. And to an untrained eye, many tips do not look like tips, just a part of the Welsh hillside. In addition to considering historic maps, LiDAR imaging, land registry records, it's also involving considering where a boundary starts and finishes, all of which is time consuming to ensure the data is accurate. At present, over 2,000 disused coal tips have been identified, but the number can change as more are located and a number of tips still have to be categorised. Over 90% of these tips are located in South Wales valleys. Interim categorizations were used to provide the status of each tip. These interim categorizations, A to D, are based on the frequency of the inspections required for each tip, so based on the potential risk if a tip is not inspected and maintained. D is a higher risk, with A the lower risk. Factors such as proximity to communities, critical infrastructure, previous movement have been captured in this categorisation. The majority of tips are privately owned, but other owners include local authorities, Natural Resources Wales, as well as other public bodies and some third sector bodies as well. This is a very live project. As we move forward, numbers do change as we move towards a more assured position. Data cleansing and categorisation of tips will be an ongoing piece of work. Next slide, please. The Welsh Government has commissioned the Coal Authority to work with local authorities to regularly inspect the higher risk rated tips, and this will continue until a new statutory framework is introduced. Works identified from inspections are now part of a maintenance programme. In addition, there's also a number of technology trials being undertaken on a number of tips. I will pass over to Tim Marples from the Coal Authority to provide an overview of all of this work.
Tim, I think you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Must be double muted.
It's fine now.
Is that okay now? Thank you. We started our work in February 2020 as the strategic partnership with Welsh Government was formed, and we worked closely and with the Coal Tips Safety Policy Task Force team. We've constantly worked throughout lockdown, and as Laurie said earlier, this project has been going at an intense pace for the last 16 months. We're using our in-house expertise and experience to undertake emergency walkover inspections of the higher rated C and D tips, and so far we've undertaken over 500 inspections of these C and D rated tips in 2 tranches. We've engaged and supported 18 local authorities on the coal field and worked collaboratively with those to ensure that all these C&D inspections haven't been undertaken to the consistent standard. We provided technical input to other strategic partners as part of this programme as well. And as Laurie said, we will come on to talk about the technology trials later. So with regards to the work we were undertaking, we have a team of trained engineers experienced in managing tip legacy. We the Coal Authority own 26 tips in Wales, and some of the more high profile tips including Aberfan. We've undertaken the inspections in collaboration with the local authorities to spread that expertise across the local authority teams, and it should be noted that the risk rating determines frequency of inspection and does not suggest imminent failure risk. It confirms the tip status and captures the maintenance requirements needed. Each tip is different and the control measures are specific to each individual tip. The inspections are physical walkovers that predominantly look for any changes since the last inspection, any areas of instability or potential instability, the condition of the tip slopes and the toe of the tip, that's where the slope meets the ground. They look for any wet or boggy areas or any areas that are holding water, because the biggest issue with tip instability is managing the water. So they also look for an effective drainage system, the condition of the ditches and the trash screens along those ditches to ensure that water can leave the tip when rainfall occurs, and any maintenance that is required, either routine or improvements to that maintenance scheme. And as part of the inspections, we consider the inspection schedule for each tip, the frequency of that inspection, what routine maintenance is in place to the ditches and the screens, the infrastructure renewal program, whether there's a weather response program. There's a 40mm trigger on many tips where you get 40mm of rain and it triggers an inspection. There's targeted ground investigations, which we always use. Instrumentation, so remote telemetric monitoring is used, and so we put monitors in the ground to check for ground movement. We also look at potentially grassing and sludging of tips and planting to increase stability on slopes and help the rain as it leaves. And then either a major or minor infrastructure program. So many improvements are discussed with the local authority as we've gone through these various tranches of inspections. And as the slide suggests, we have undertaken the first tranche was taken immediately after the initial storms. A second tranche was undertaken, which has now been complete, and we are now planning the third winter tranche, which will start in September, and the Coal Authority will be undertaking all of these inspections with the local authorities to ensure a consistent standard. With regards to technology trials, we've been asked to look at this. So we have 2 satellite projects ongoing, one looking at whether satellites can pick up ground movement, and one looking at whether we can monitor water flow and whether we can monitor moisture within tips. And we've also undertaken ground telemetric monitoring of tips, so remote 24/7 monitoring. So many technologies are being tested, so this can be undertaken remotely and linked to the appropriate local authority area. So with that, Laurie, I'll hand back over to you from an operational point of view.
Laurie, you're on mute.
Thanks, Tim. Over the summer last year, the coal tip safety team in the Welsh Government undertook an initial review of the legislative framework and identified a number of deficiencies. In particular, there was no effective management regime for disused coal tip safety, including there was no consistent approach to risk assessment or categorization, no mandatory requirement to inspect and maintain, no monitoring, oversight and enforcement. And as mentioned previously, there was also no central register. Wanting to progress this work, Leslie Griffiths, the Minister for Energy, Environment and Rural Affairs, requested the Law Commission to undertake a review of the legislation underpinning disused coal tips, and the Commission agreed and commenced the work in November 2020, as Nick has already commented on. The Welsh Government has committed to introduce new legislation during the current Senedd, but no date has been provided as we will await the report from the Law Commission and its recommendations and undertake a full options analysis. Next slide, please. I just want to finish by providing an overview of the phasing of the programme of work. Phase 1 represented the immediate response and has now ended. And we are currently in phase 2, which we're calling the Interim Approach. It is interim as it includes key work activities which will continue until a new statutory regime is in place. In the interim phase, inspections will continue to be undertaken by the Coal Authority and local authorities, and maintenance works will be ongoing. We will collate data from the technology trials to assess the most appropriate technology for monitoring any movement on tips. And in phase 3, therefore, illustrates the ongoing interim approach while legislation is introduced in the Senedd at some point in the future. And also during this time, preparatory work will be ongoing in relation to a reclamation programme, considering the potential opportunities to turn, where possible, the legacy of coal tips into something productive and beneficial for communities. In phase 4, we're calling it the implementation phase, but here is when the new statutory regime is up and running, and there will be a new inspection, maintenance, monitoring and oversight programme. Next slide, please. For further information, please visit the Welsh Government Coal Tip Safety webpage. And if you have any concerns about a tip, the Coal Authority are operating a coal tip safety helpline, which is included on this final slide. Thank you. I will now pass over to the Law Commission and to Nicholas.
Thanks very much, Laurie. This is part 2 of tonight's event, and you're going to hear from me and the members of the team doing the day-to-day work on the project. I'll say a bit more about the Law Commission first. As I said, we're a statutory body created by an Act of Parliament in 1965 with the task of reviewing the law in England and Wales. We consist of 5 commissioners and we divide up the law between us. My internal responsibility is for public law, that's to say, law governing relations between citizens and the state, with particular reference to our work in Wales, which has so far been in the public law area. We've now done a number of projects with a view to legislation by the Senedd, and it's, as I said earlier, a very important part of our work. Everything that we publish is approved by all 5 of the commissioners, but our day-to-day work is done by teams supervised by the commissioners responsible for the particular work area. We have teams usually consisting of experienced law reform lawyers accompanied by research assistants, and that they are startlingly brilliant young lawyers at the start of their careers who come to us for a year or 2 before moving on, usually to legal practice or work in academia. The project on the team rather conducting this project consists of Lisa Smith, who is leading the work, and the research assistant is Poppy Jones, born and raised in the Gower. You'll be hearing from both of them in the course of this presentation. The thing I always say about us is that we are a highly consultative organisation. In all our projects, we publish a detailed consultation paper, and I'm lucky enough to have a printed copy of it here, but you can find it on our website. Poppy's already put the link into the Q&A chat. We go into a lot of detail in our consultation papers. We set out the problem, we review the existing law, we form provisional views on how the law might be improved, and in these consultation papers we ask the world at large to give us their comments. We're entirely open-minded about the provisional proposals that we make. We tend to make provisional proposals because we've found that we get more helpful responses from consultees if we give them something to get their teeth into. But invariably we alter, modify, or even abandon some of our provisional proposals in the light of what stakeholders tell us about them. This consultation paper contains 34 questions, a number of which are open questions, but at least half are in the form of provisional proposals, which we're keen to hear your views upon. And we've also published, again on the website, a shorter summary of the longer paper with the questions set out at the back of it. Please do have a look at those, and you'll also find a link to our online consultation form, which you may find a convenient way of responding, but we also accept responses by email or even snail mail if you want to send us something on paper. You don't need to feel you have to answer all the questions. Please answer any questions that you have a view on or something to contribute about. The consultation paper is, if you like, the centerpiece of our consultations, but we also hold consultation events. And in pre-COVID days, we would hold them locally. At the moment, we're having to operate COVID secure, and so we're having this event as well as a number of other more specialised consultation events online. And as I said earlier, we're very grateful to all of you who've given up the time to join this evening, and look forward at the end of the evening to answering the questions in the Q&A chat. I'm going to say a bit about the current law, which is on this slide that's up there. Poppy's going to say a bit more about it after me. The Mines and Quarries Tips Act of 1969 gave local authorities some powers over the tips associated with disused mines. They were a bit of an adjunct to the much greater powers given over tips that were that were associated with active mines. The safety of the tips was added into the existing regime for the safety of the colliery operations generally. And that aspect of the Act, which is now replaced by health and safety legislation, seems to have worked very well. But the provisions for disused tips, which were regarded as much less of a problem, gave responsibilities but no particular duties or powers to local authorities. The powers are limited to cases where a tip is unstable. The procedures are somewhat cumbersome. Local authorities have very little by way of compulsory powers of their own. The legislation relies upon applications to the court if landowners don't cooperate. Through that cumbersome mechanism, that local authorities can obtain a power of entry where a tip is suspected of being both unstable and dangerous. If the tip proves to be unstable, they can give notice to landowners requiring work to be done, but the landowners can respond saying, you do the work. Local authorities do have a self-standing power to do work if authorised by the court if necessary. And there are more mechanisms, again rather cumbersome, by which various people can be required to contribute to the cost of those works. I won't trespass on what Poppy and Lisa are going to tell you, but we've provisionally identified quite a few problems with this now 50-year-old legislation, and we've set them out in our consultation paper. We'll touch on some of them this evening, and we're keen to hear the views of all of you on the best solution that we might come up with. That's a fairly general introduction from me. I'm now going to hand over to Poppy, who is going to detail some of the events that have taken place since the Act was passed half a century ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. I'm just going to run quickly through, if I could have the next slide, please, Anne. Thank you. Why the Act is like it is, and the changes that have meant that the Act is no longer fit for purpose. So at the time the Act was passed in 1969, there was thought to be little risk from disused tips. When they were discussing the bill in Parliament, the Minister at the time said that many tips are no longer recognisable as such. They have been overgrown with vegetation and have long formed part of the landscape. Others are more recent. But with the passage of time, most of these tips have become increasingly stable, thanks to natural consolidation. The surveys that have been carried out since Aberfan indicate that only a very small proportion could present any hazard to members of the public. But because nothing can be certain, we have felt it necessary to give local authorities powers to identify and deal with any tips that give grounds for anxiety, and to make provision for exchequer grants. The emphasis in the Act was therefore on operational tips, which is why the powers provided to local authorities are so limited. There was, however, a dissenting opinion expressed by Arthur Probert, the MP at the time for Aberdare. He said that there are a number of coal tips in my area, one of which recently started to move, thereby causing great anxiety. My right honourable friend, the Minister of Power, has said that trouble is invariably caused by active working tips. I have a theory that many tips which are now 40 or 50 years old are reaching a stage at which trouble can arise. We should look more closely at tips which are not actively working, as well as keeping under observation those which are. However, this was a minority opinion, and at the time, the majority of the MPs seemed to think that disused tips were very unlikely to pose any kind of a risk. The Act was also passed against the backdrop of an active industry. The situation has now changed dramatically. There are now only a few operational mines in Wales, but there are more than 2,000 disused tips. Geographically, they are spread unevenly across different local authorities. The burden falls disproportionately on a small number. Rainfall has increased significantly due to climate change. This increases the risk of instability, particularly if drainage issues are not addressed. 70% of disused tips are in private ownership, owned by landowners who in the main have no connection with the mining industry, no vested or economic interest in maintaining the tip, or skill or knowledge concerning the care of tips. Could I have the next slide, please, Owen? So this has led to a number of problems. We heard about these problems with the current regime from the key stakeholders. Local authorities were given limited powers to intervene, as you've just heard. The power to intervene arises where it appears to the authority that the tip is unstable and by reason of that instability constitutes a danger to the public. It's a bit of a catch-22 situation. The authorities are unable to intervene until they can prove the risk, but they are unable to prove the risk without intervention. We've also heard from stakeholders that landowners may try to prevent entry by arguing that there is no danger to the public if the tip were to slide, or that the risk could be alleviated by other means, such as closing a public footpath. The work required to prove that a tip is a danger to the public is expensive and difficult, as the test is ultimately subjective. There is no general duty to inspect. There is also no power to compel tip owners to carry out basic maintenance, usually in relation to drainage, which would prevent the tip from becoming unstable. There is essentially a gap in the legislation between inspection on the one hand and urgent remediation on the other. This can mean that authorities must wait until they can show that a tip is a danger to the public before they can intervene. Landowners are often also unaware of their maintenance responsibilities. We have been hearing that the 1969 Act mechanisms to compel owners to do remedial works are cumbersome and time-consuming. The alternative, which is for the local authority to do the work and then to charge the owner, is also unwieldy. We've heard that the local authorities prefer to proceed by negotiation and want to avoid incurring legal costs. In addition, for various reasons, including constraints on resources, retirements and council restructuring, many local authorities have lost specialist knowledge in tip safety. There was a clear view expressed by all local authorities that there was no capacity to cope with any increased burdens. The powers are also fragmented over different local authorities, leading to differing risk classifications. There can also be clashes between the 1969 regime and environmental law. The 1969 Act was not designed to interact with environmental protection legislation. For example, if a tip moves, it becomes waste, which falls under the environmental permitting regulations, which means that a permit will be required to move the waste. In the event of a tip slide, the cleanup works could be urgent, but applying for a permit can take time. The permitting requirements could therefore obstruct remediation and cleanup works. Chapter 7 of the consultation paper describes these problems in more depth, but I hope that that was a helpful overview. I'll now hand over to Lisa to describe our provisional proposals.
Thank you, Poppy. Hello, everyone. So, following our review of the current law, as Nick and Poppy have just been outlining, we concluded that what we needed was a system that offered consistency and the prevention of harm through adopting a proactive rather than a reactive approach. So to this end, our consultation paper puts forward a number of proposed elements for a new regulatory framework. And these are set out on this slide in their most basic form. And you can also look at the end of our consultation paper and the summary for a flow chart that sets them out in a more digestible form. But I'm going to go through each of the elements in turn just to give you an idea of what they involve. So the first is our proposal for a single supervisory authority for disused tips. This would be a body under a duty to supervise the management of disused tips in such a way as to ensure their safety. And our proposal is for the duty to be framed as a general duty rather than one limited to specified risks such as instability. And one of the functions of the supervisory authority would be to compile and maintain a tip register. The register entry for each tip would include stipulated information to provide an initial template for the tips management. The supervisory authority would have a duty to include any tip of which it is aware. We think that this would cover almost all tips, but we also propose that a tip owner would be under a duty to notify of the existence of a tip where it's not already been registered. Then after first registration, we propose that the authority should be under a duty to arrange an inspection of the tip. The purpose of the inspection would be to undertake a risk assessment and to design a tip management plan. The plan would be based on all the relevant features of the tip. So it would be based on the tip's physical profile, for example, its volume, height, drainage, stability, the impact of natural features, the presence of features like mine workings, as well as on the receptors that would be impacted in the event of a tip failure. For example, buildings, road and rail infrastructure and water courses. And the tip management plan could take into consideration all hazards, for example, pollution and internal combustion, not just those relating to instability. And it could also consider the tip's proximity to other tips, so that the plan could in practice be developed as a consolidated plan for a cluster of tips. The plan would include specifications such as the frequency of inspection, the maintenance and remediation work required, and a timescale for their completion. One of the most important functions of the initial inspection would be to decide if the tip met the threshold for designation as a hazardous tip. If that threshold is met, a more rigorous safety regime would be applied with increased involvement by the supervisory authority. And our consultation paper sets out a list of possible reasons for designation. And again, we're just setting these out as possible reasons and want to hear from you about what we may not have thought about. So, for example, we've listed a history of instability, the likely impact of a tip slide on buildings or infrastructure, risk of pollution or flooding, or a need for significant engineering work. If the decision is to give a tip designated status, we propose that it would normally be the supervisory authority that would carry out the operations specified in the tip management plan. But we acknowledge that there are likely to be cases where the tip owner is much better placed to carry out the work itself, particularly where the owner is a public authority, such as a local authority or the coal authority. We also provisionally propose that a tip owner should have a right of appeal against designation. The next step is to consider what happens for the vast majority of tips that do not need designation. Stakeholders tell us that the primary problem for this type of low-risk tip is the absence of a power to require the owner to undertake maintenance work. It's proactive maintenance work that stops the tip from becoming a hazard. Our proposal is for lower-risk tips to be covered by maintenance agreements, and these agreements would be reached with the tip owner. This could be backed up with a power to make a maintenance order in the event of non-compliance. We envisage that maintenance agreements would take a highly prescriptive approach to assist tip owners with low levels of knowledge of tip safety. There would be a duty on the part of the authority to inspect the tip covered by the agreement. This would be necessary to ensure compliance by the tip owner with the agreement or order. One of the questions we put in our paper is where responsibility for this lower level category of tip should fall. It might be that it falls to the supervisory authority, or it might be that it remains with the local authority as at present. And we can see arguments both ways. Local authorities have local knowledge. The work could fit in with work such as drainage and flood risk management. But on the other hand, you've got a continued fragmentation of control, possible inconsistencies arising, and you may have reduced cost effectiveness. Finally, the new regime would need adequate enforcement and charging powers. We propose a wider power of entry than the powers currently provided by the 69 Act. This power would permit entry onto land containing a disused tip for certain specified purposes, for example, investigation, maintenance and repair. Procedural guarantees would be needed, such as entry at a reasonable time, having given notice, but these guarantees could be waived in the event of an emergency. In terms of sanctions, as is the case under the 1969 Act, we propose that it should be a criminal offence to fail to comply with an order or to obstruct an operation. But we don't think that non-compliance with a maintenance agreement by a tip owner should be a criminal offence. We think that non-compliance should lead to a tip maintenance order. We also propose a general charging power. The funding of operations on coal tips is outside our terms of reference. It's a policy matter for the Welsh Government, but we propose a general power to charge to allow these policy decisions to be made. Our paper does look at some of the issues around charging. We've heard from local authorities in conversations that Poppy was touching on earlier when we spoke to stakeholders before we wrote our consultation paper. And they told us that in practical terms, recouping funds from owners under the current law can be very difficult. And they've also pointed out that there is a gap in the provisions, as there's no power to charge for maintenance work and no power to charge for exploratory tests, which do not lead to remedial work. Can I have the next slide, please? So on this slide, there's a sample of our consultation questions. As Nick said, there are 34 of them. You absolutely are not being asked to answer all of them unless you want to, but this is to just give you a flavour. So in terms of the supervisory authority, we ask for views on what form the proposed authority should take. Should it be a new or existing body? If it's a new body, what form should it take? We ask about the tip register. Do you think it's a good idea? And if so, should it be public? We ask for views on the possible reasons for designating a tip as a high-risk tip. We ask who you think should be responsible for lower-risk tips. Should this be the supervisory authority, or should responsibility remain with the local authority? We ask a number of questions about how to resolve the tension between tip safety and environment legislation. We suggest, for example, that Welsh ministers could give directions to the supervisory authority in the event of an emergency, or alternatively, the defence available to an authority in the event of an emergency to protect them from breaches of environmental legislation could be widened. But we also ask an open question. Can you suggest any other approaches to deal with clashes between tip safety work and environmental legislation? And finally, this is the very last question in the paper. We ask if tip safety legislation should be combined with provision for tip reclamation, and if so, what model should be used? And we state very clearly this is actually outside our terms of reference, but we know that it's a matter of interest to stakeholders, and we know that the Welsh Government would welcome views. So, as we've said, we're very keen to hear your views. It's important that you see the consultation paper as asking questions and considering possible solutions, but we need to hear from you before we formulate our recommendations. If your time's limited, I recommend looking at the summary. It will give you everything you need to know. But the full consultation paper, especially the final chapter, does give you more detail about our reasoning. And then, as I've said, there's a useful flowchart at the end of the consultation paper and the summary. And there's also a brief visual guide up on our website, which looks at the flowchart more closely and attaches the questions that arise for each element. Can I have the next slide, please? So you can find everything you need that I've mentioned on our coal tip project page on the Law Commission website. And that includes, as Nick mentioned, an online response form, which we hope will provide quite a straightforward way of responding. And the link to all those documents is up on the slide, and we've also, I think, already put it into the Q&A. And in addition to the online form, we're happy to accept responses by email and post. And we know sometimes for organisations it's actually easier to respond by email because it's harder to share the online form between different respondents. The key date for you is that the consultation closes on the 10th of September. So we would ask for your responses before then. And Owen, can you take the slides down for me now? So we're going to move on to questions now. We may not be able to answer all the questions, but if there are any we can't get to, we'll do our best to contact you with a reply. And also, if there are questions that occur to you later, or you want to discuss our paper later, or for people watching the recording, if you want to contact us, we're happy to arrange face-to-face meetings to discuss any elements of interest to you. Just a final reminder of the timeline. After the consultation closes, we analyse the consultation responses, and we're anticipating that our final report with our recommendations will be published in early 2022. And I'll pass back to our Commissioner to look at the questions coming through from you. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and the others for presenting. This is now our question and answer session. We've had a few questions through, and please do send some more. I'm conscious that we've delivered quite a lot of information to you at quite a pace in quite a short period, but and we don't expect you to have thought of the answers while we've been presenting the problems. But please, as Lisa was saying, please do feel free to get in touch either by the online form or by emailing the team if you would like to discuss something orally. We've already, I think, put into the Q&A chat a link to our website where you will find the consultation paper, the summary, and the online response form. There's also been a query about the slides, and what we will do is that's to say Poppy probably will email to you individually both the slide presentations. We haven't got a link that we can just put on the website, but we will send them to you all by email. If you want any clarifications in the course of tonight, do just send a question in on that. Anything you care to raise, we're here to deal with, and we have up to half an hour or so available to answer queries, accept suggestions, whatever you might like to pass to us. Now, in terms of the questions we've had through already, Councillor Sarah Thomas has asked a question about application of our project to landfill and quarrying. The position here is that the 1969 legislation that we've been telling you about, that applies to all mines and quarries, whatever the mineral being extracted. In contrast, this project of ours, which we wanted to get done quickly in view of the urgency of sorting out the coal tips, is in terms limited to coal tips. But we're mindful of the possibility that our recommendations might be extended to other types of mine and quarry, no doubt potentially including at least gravel extraction. And in the consultation paper, we asked, if in a sense on behalf of the Welsh Government, for any views you've got on the desirability of extending the new legislation to other types of minerals, and whatever you suggest we will pass on to Laurie and the Welsh Government for them to consider. Councillor Sarah Thomas has also asked a question about the remedial and reclamation work that we've talked about, and Dr. Stephen Murray's asked a question about the impact of reclamation work on the biodiversity that's been achieved on a number of the existing tips. I'm going to invite Laurie to deal with those two questions, if she would.
Thanks, Nick. Sarah, in terms of your question about the reclamation by government owned, or would it be owned, created and maintained by the energy company? I think, you know, as Poppy mentioned when she was giving her presentation, our findings are found that the majority of the private owners of coal tips are people who have had absolutely no involvement with the creation of these coal tips. And they're often, what we're finding is that some of these private owners are very small holdings. They could be farmers. So the reclamation programme that we're looking at, this is something we won't be considering until later on. Our focus at the moment is making sure that we're we're making sure the inspections and the maintenance and the new legislation is developed. But it will consider how we can prioritise any of this reclamation works to ensure that it's being carried out on the most needed tips initially, and we will then have to consider in relation to who the owner is, and who would the financing of this. Just to reiterate, and the relation to the financing for the reclamation programme, this is something that the First Minister has been looking at, and there's been negotiations going on with the UK government in this matter, because Wales is disproportionately impacted by this industrial legacy, and it's not something that has been considered in and it's a pre-devolution matter that was not reflected in the Barnett formula. So from the First Minister's perspective, he is been having discussions with the UK government in relation to the funding of this. But all of these factors about in terms of the ownership and owners being a reclamation work being carried out, and what would happen in terms of the continued ownership post that, are all factors that will need to be considered in the due diligence of any reclamation works that are undertaken on these coal tips. And in terms of the impact of reclamation, the fact that biodiversity in many of these tips are now are highly biodiversity rich is another key factor that we will be taking into consideration, Stephen. I think we will look at the different types of potential opportunities there may be, and some of these actually may be about further creation of biodiversity and of habitats, whether or not there is actually an opportunity for a biodiverse coal tip, which is in a stable condition, and whether or not there's then a role for that potentially in ecological networks and actually building on the biodiversity. So it's a key factor that we are considering, and it may actually be the coal tips may be an opportunity to actually expand upon our biodiversity and build upon that.
Thanks very much, Laurie. There's been a question about whether we will be liaising with the Colliery Spoil Biodiversity Project. I think the answer is, let's listen anymore. We'd be delighted to hear from you, either through the online response form or get in touch with Lisa and Poppy through the email address. And we'd be delighted to meet.
We have had a response. We have been in touch with them.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lisa. There's been a question or two about enforcement and what to do with tips that aren't being properly maintained. Lisa, would you like to say a bit more about what we envisage here in terms of management agreements and orders?
Yes, is this the question about how long it would take to get a maintenance order for a tip that isn't being properly maintained?
Yes, in particular.
Yes, okay. Because just by way of background, I can say that the way we've envisaged it is that initially there would be, the objective would be to secure an agreement, but it might not be possible right from the outset. It might not be possible to reach agreement with the tip owner, in which case the authority would move to a tip maintenance order. Alternatively, the agreement could be reached, but then when the local authority inspects and finds that the tip owner hasn't complied, it would then move to an order. I'm not able to say how long that process would take, but I can say that the idea has been drawn from the regime for non-native species, and we look at this in some detail in our in chapter 9 of the consultation paper. And it might be that looking at that regime and how the agreements are working there and the ability to back up compliance with an order could be a good indication of how well it might work for coal tips. But we're not able to say at this early stage in the consultation how long it would take in practice.
No, it's partly a question of the resourcing of the new body. We've been asked another question by Sarah Thomas about enforcement and charging powers. I mean, this is an area on which Lisa will tell you, in the discussions we've had with all the affected local authorities, the lack of powers and cumbersome nature of the current enforcement process is something that's been stressed to us. So we're very keen to introduce a regime with adequate powers, order-making powers we're proposing for the supervisory authority, with obviously a right of appeal. But the authority could make orders subject to appeal rather than having to traipse off to the local county court and try and persuade the judge to make an order in the first instance. Lisa, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just that in my presentation, I said we were contemplating criminal sanctions for obstruction of operations or for breach of an order, but not for failure to comply with an agreement, because that would just lead to the imposition of an order. I can see that the latter part of the question is about a sanction of a compulsory purchase of the land, and that's not something we've covered actually, and it would be an interesting point to raise in a consultation response.
Yes. Any suggestions like that? We don't claim we've thought of everything. Please do make these suggestions to us in the course of the consultation period, and we'll consider them when we formulate our final recommendations. I think I've covered there, or I hope I have not missed aspects of the questions. Would anybody else like to put a question in the Q&A?
Nick, I've spotted one that I don't think we've covered.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
That's okay, it just went through, but it's about addressing skills shortages for inspections. And actually it's a really interesting point. One element in our consultation paper that we propose is a specialist panel of engineers. I didn't cover it because we just couldn't cover everything in the paper, but it is there in the paper to look at. And that would be a way of ensuring the appropriate skill level, but it doesn't in itself address a skill shortage. But I have heard it suggested in discussions about that panel and about also having a supervisory authority that it would be a good way to get a kind of a consistent training system going under one authority rather than fragmented across a number of authorities. Laurie, did you want to add something in on that? Go ahead.
Thanks, Lisa. Yes, it's a really important factor in all of this. You know, we are looking at the introduction of a new management regime for coal tip safety, and it's absolutely key that we're able to implement that. And that does mean that we have to look at the fact that, you know, that there is a skill shortage in Wales, but it's not just in Wales alone. So it's one of the factors that we are looking at this moment. We are discussing with the local authorities the particular issues, and we will, you know, and as Lisa said, the panel of engineers is one aspect of this, but we will look at how we can seek other opportunities, you know, talking to the universities to how we can address this particular issue of a skills shortage. And we will want to also talk to all of the engineering companies as well, to get to an understanding of how we can all come together and identify potential solutions to this problem. Thanks, Lisa.
We've had a question about damage to tips by off-road bikers. This is something that the Law Commission team know a tiny amount about, because when we visited the Rhondda Valley, we could see, particularly on the old Smoky tip, the ruts caused by motorcycle scrambling. So we're aware it's a problem. We haven't made any specific proposals to address it in the consultation paper. It's, I imagine, illegal anyway, but there must be issues of enforcement. I don't know whether Tim or Laurie want to say any more about that particular problem. We know it's a problem, and we refer to it in the problems chapter of the paper. But if people feel we should address it, we'll consider a recommendation.
Nick, absolutely, and it's a really good point to raise. And again, I would encourage people to contribute those kinds of responses to the consultation. I think one of the things that we are keen to consider are activities on tips that may create stability problems. I think that's vitally important that is covered as well, so that we consider whether or not there is a potential policy solution to this, and if we need to consider that as also including any kind of actions into the legislation that, you know, that there might be activities that need to be monitored and managed on coal tips.
Can I just add a word, Laurie? From the perspective of our proposals, when we've talked about a tip management plan that I went through when I went through those elements, we envisaged that very much being in relation to the individual tip, and Tim was emphasising how each tip is individual and different, and if there is an issue around off-roading or an instability risk created by activities, we would have thought that that would then be incorporated into the plan for that tip or that group of tips.
Yeah, that's exactly, sounds like the kind, you know, we want to make sure that because tips are different, an activity on one tip may be absolutely cause no problems at all, but an activity on same activity on another tip could be problematic. And so, you know, the management plan could be a good solution to that, but it would be really interesting then to hear from the stakeholders that, you know, their views on that as well. Thanks, Lisa.
Yes, can I just thank Stephen Murray for the link that you've put in the chat. We'll certainly have a look at that. Lisa will probably tell me she's looked at it several times already, but if we haven't, we shall look at it. Sarah Thomas has asked a question about unknown spoil sites. That's a technical matter that is way outside my expertise. We cover it in the consultation paper to the extent that we propose a tip register, and we propose a power for the authority to add further tips to it should they come to light. But I'll have to leave it to Tim and Laurie to comment on the extent to which there might be spoil sites that haven't been discovered yet.
We need to unmute, Tim. No,
Have we lost Tim?
we're not getting any sound. Can you hear us, Tim?
No.
I could answer the question if Tim's having trouble. Tim, are you unmuted?
I think I am.
Oh,
Are we back? Are we back? Can you hear me, Laurie?
Yep, we can hear you.
So I don't know what's happening with the technology. It's obviously something at my end. I can just reassure everybody listening that for the last 12 months, we've had a data management team that's trawled every historic map, every satellite image, every historic record held by Welsh Government and local authorities. And we have picked up every coal tip that has been identified in those plans from the earliest edition of all those plans. And we have then collaborated and consulted with each local authority to check those plans with their local knowledge. So I'm quite confident we have picked up all the coal tips that exist within the coalfields in Wales.
thanks very much, Tim. We've had a couple of questions about fires on tips. I don't know whether the questioners are referring to spontaneous combustion of the tip material or fires on the surface. We do in the consultation paper raise the question whether the new regime should cover tip hazards going beyond instability, and we discuss pollution, combustion, and oh dear, my brain's gone. Flooding. Thank you so much, Lisa. We're keen to receive views on whether those other hazards should be included in the regime. So please do contribute on that. My understanding, but I defer to Laurie and Tim here, is that spontaneous combustion can be very problematic, and we recount in the consultation paper, Poppy did a lot of research on this, instances of fires that burned for years. I think in Aberfan, even prior to the disaster, there was a problem with fire for years, and the villagers' lives were made miserable by the atmospheric pollution before the terrible disaster hit them. Tim and Laurie, do you want to say anything more about hazards other than instability?
Tim, do you want to answer?
Hello, yes, Laurie. I'm having trouble with the muting here. I would refer to Nicholas's previous answer, which was that as part of the consultation for people to pass their view about additional hazards, because yes, there are additional hazards besides instability, and fires being, you know, a major one that we've had communications with various local authorities in Wales, as well as the fire service. So I would suggest that people respond to the consultation.
Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but wildfire doesn't necessarily create any instability in the tip, is that right?
Yes, not necessarily, Laurie, you're right. It doesn't create any additional instability, but it does provide other hazards. Public safety hazards, yeah, and environmental hazards.
We've had a comment on flooding, I see, management works that NRW have undertaken in one tip. Then we're getting towards the allotted time span. Please do put any more questions in that you care to raise. Otherwise, can I ask the other presenters whether there's anything they would like to add to what we've said so far? Well, I'll just repeat how grateful the half dozen of us are to all of you for spending the time to listen to us tonight, and for the questions you've asked and the suggestions you've made. Please do get in touch. We've told you how to, and we're very keen to hear from you. We hope you found this worthwhile, and we hope you may find a bit of time to look either at the full consultation paper or at the much shorter summary that's been referred to. They're both on the website, and we hope you will find them interesting to read. And as I said at the beginning, we want to make the best recommendations we can, and we need the help of all of you to get them right. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.